January 30th, 1944. Bougainville Island, Solomon Islands, 7:45 in the morning. The jungle smells of rot and wet earth, and something older than memory. The ancient patience of stone and wood pressed together into walls that were never meant to fall. The air hangs heavy with moisture, the kind that soaks through cloth and settles inside a man's lungs before he has taken his second breath of the day. Along the eastern perimeter of the American beachhead at Empress Augusta Bay, the morning light has not yet decided whether to arrive. It filters down through the triple canopy in thin, silver threads, illuminating nothing cleanly, casting every shadow into ambiguity. Somewhere ahead, buried beneath the earth and wrapped in reinforced logs and packed dirt, hundreds of Japanese soldiers are awake. They have been awake for hours. They are listening. And they are certain, absolutely certain, that they cannot be touched. They called this place the Hornets Nest. As it was a name given by American soldiers who had bled against it and pulled back, who had sent patrols into its fringes and watched men fall to fire from positions that seemed to appear from nowhere and dissolve back into the earth. The Japanese had built their defenses here across several hundred yards of jungle along the east bank of the Torokina River, anchoring both flanks on the coastline and the river, layering their fighting positions in depth so that any assault against the outer edge of the perimeter would be taken under fire simultaneously from 3 directions. 37 large reinforced log bunkers, each constructed with interlocking fields of fire, each capable of surviving the most determined infantry assault without armored support. Machine gun slits cut at ground level, interconnected tunnels beneath the mud. It was, by anybody's honest measure, a masterpiece of defensive military engineering, and the soldiers inside it had every reason to believe they were invulnerable. They had not yet seen what was coming. To understand what was about to happen on the morning of January 30th, 1944, one must first understand the nature of the war that had been building for 3 years across the island chains of the Pacific. Since the disaster of Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, American forces had been pressing westward through some of the most inhospitable terrain on Earth. Jungle islands baking in equatorial heat, coral atolls barely 2 feet above sea level, volcanic rock formations that tore apart boot leather and drank blood. At Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at New Georgia, American Marines and soldiers had confronted the same terrible problem again and again. The Japanese did not fight as other armies fought, and they did not mass their forces in the open and conduct maneuver warfare. They dug, they burrowed, they carved fighting positions out of hillsides and buried bunkers under meters of reinforced earth, and they sat inside those positions and waited for Americans to walk into their pre-registered kill zones, and they killed them at close range, and they kept killing until they themselves were killed. There was no other way this arrangement was ever going to end, and every man on both sides understood this. The question that plagued American commanders was not whether these positions could be overcome. The question was how to overcome them without spending men like water. The portable flamethrower had offered a partial answer since January of 1943, when a team of American engineers on Guadalcanal crawled within 25 yards of a fortified bunker line and burned out 3 positions in a single day. But the portable flamethrower was a confession of courage wrapped in a prayer. It weighed more than 60 pounds fully loaded. It required the operator to approach within yards of a position that was actively trying to kill him. Its range was measured in feet, not meters. And the moment that bright orange stream ignited against a bunker entrance, every Japanese soldier within 200 yards knew exactly where to concentrate his fire. The life expectancy of a portable flamethrower operator in close contact with the enemy was, by conservative estimate, measured in minutes. Some accounts suggest the figure was as low as 4, and yet men carried these weapons into the jungle, because the alternative was that the bunkers would stand forever. This calculus weighed upon the minds of officers throughout the South Pacific through the autumn of 1943. On the island of New Caledonia, several hundred miles behind the front lines. And an officer of the 754th Tank Battalion was looking at an M3A1 Stuart light tank and having a thought that would change the character of the war. The M3A1 was a 12-ton reconnaissance vehicle, nimble for its class, lightly armored by the standards of European tank warfare, mounting a 37mm cannon and a bow-mounted .30 caliber machine gun. It was not designed to assault fortified positions, but it was armored enough to absorb small arms fire. Yet it was fast enough to close distance quickly, and it had a small pistol port in the turret through which a man could, theoretically, fire a handheld weapon. What if the flamethrower operator did not have to walk? What if the armor of the tank could carry both the weapon and the man close enough to burn out what artillery could not destroy and infantry could not survive approaching? The resulting improvisation was crude by any engineering standard. 2 5-gallon fuel cylinders from the M1A1 portable flamethrower were fitted inside the tank's hull, one on the floor in front of the bow gunner's position, one behind the seat. The flame gun itself was shortened and adapted to fit through the bow machine gun mount. The entire arrangement provided approximately 20 seconds of fire at close range. 20 seconds, the width of a breath. But in 20 seconds, pressed against the aperture of a reinforced log bunker, that stream of burning fuel could accomplish something that a month of artillery preparation could not. It could reach inside. By October of 1943, demonstrations had been held near Noumea for American, Australian, and New Zealand officers. The footage from those demonstrations shows men standing in lines watching a stream of orange fire reach out from a tank's bow and cling to a target, the way living things cling to something they have chosen to consume. As the faces of the observers carry an expression that is difficult to read at this distance, something between relief and unease, the recognition that a new instrument of war has been born, and that it will do what it was built to do. The intention was to have the tank flamethrowers ready for combat in time for the November 1943 landings on Bougainville. Delays pushed the first true combat test to January of the following year, and now it was January 30th, 1944. Yet the morning mist was still in the trees. The artillery preparation had already begun. 4.2-inch mortars first, then 81mm rounds, then the main divisional guns crashing into the Hornets Nest at 0800. Observers, including Major General John Hodge himself, had gathered near the line of departure. There was a quality of confidence in the air that morning that the fighting would later expose as premature. Hodge and his staff had concluded that with tank support and a proper artillery preparation, the assault would be a pushover. Senior officers had come to watch. Reporters were present with cameras. No one who was there that morning could have known that the day would cost 1 Medal of Honor, multiple Silver Stars, a cluster of officers dead in the jungle mud, and several tank crews fighting for their lives within minutes of the jump-off. The tanks of Company A, 754th Tank Battalion moved out at 0830 behind the infantry of Company C, 132nd Infantry Regiment. Almost immediately, the morning went wrong. At 0904, one of the M3A1 light tanks was struck by American friendly artillery fire 200 yards past the line of departure and caught fire, killing the tank commander, Sergeant Minor J. Hall, and wounding 2 more crewmen. The improvised flamethrowers had only 20 seconds of fuel per full charge and were forced to pull back periodically to repressurize and refuel. The jungle offered no clean lines of advance. Japanese small arms fire poured from positions that were barely visible at 20 yards. A second tank became hopelessly mired on a banyan tree stump and had to be abandoned. The battlefield was, in the blunt assessment of every after-action report filed that day, nothing like what had been expected. And yet, by afternoon, something had shifted. Around 13:30 hours, 5 light tanks returned to the forward line after rearming, and the advance resumed. The tanks used their 37mm guns to blast at bunker apertures, then closed to burning range and held the flame gun against whatever was left of the entrance until nothing remained inside that could continue to resist. By the end of January 30th, 1944, 28 large bunkers in the Hornets Nest had been destroyed. 14 of those 28 were credited directly to the flamethrower tanks. Another 4 fell to riflemen. 1 was taken out by mortar fire. The rest fell to the combined pressure of armor and infantry working at close range in the jungle heat. Approximately 200 Japanese soldiers died in and around the Hornets' Nest that day. A position that had resisted weeks of artillery bombardment and 2 previous infantry assaults collapsed in a single afternoon once armored flame was brought to bear. At the after-action report of the 754th Tank Battalion, read with the measured confidence of men who had just discovered something important. The action proved conclusively, it stated, that the tank infantry team could be used to excellent advantage in jungle terrain. This was understatement. What had been proven was more specific and more consequential than that. It had been proven that a weapon existed which could reach inside a fortified Japanese position, bypass the steel and logs and packed earth, and deliver destruction to the men within, men who had believed with absolute conviction that they were beyond the reach of anything the Americans could bring forward. The 20 seconds of fuel in those improvised M3A1 tanks on Bougainville were not the end of this story. They were the first sentence. Before one can follow what the flamethrower tanks became, what they grew into in the months that followed, and what they meant to the men who faced them, it is necessary to understand something about the Japanese military mind of 1944. The Imperial Japanese Army had by this point in the war absorbed the lessons of Guadalcanal and Tarawa and New Georgia, and those lessons had pointed in a single direction. The Japanese soldier could not defeat the Americans in open battle. American firepower was too overwhelming, American logistical capacity too immense, American air power too dominant for any Japanese force holding open ground to survive contact for long. But the Japanese soldier who was underground, who was inside concrete, who was behind meters of reinforced earth, that soldier was something close to unkillable by conventional means. The Americans could bomb the island for weeks. The shells could churn the surface into craters. And beneath all of it, the Japanese soldier would remain, waiting, breathing, ready to emerge the moment the bombardment lifted and the landing craft touched the shore. This was not merely a tactical doctrine. It was a philosophical conviction rooted in a cultural tradition that equated stoic endurance with honor and surrender with a form of death more complete than physical destruction. The Bushido Code, as it had been reinterpreted and hardened into imperial military ideology by the 1940s, had held that the warrior who died in place, who consumed his body in service to the emperor, had fulfilled the highest calling a human life could produce. Surrender was not a degraded form of survival. It was something worse than death. It was the erasure of the self from the record of honor. And because the Japanese soldier understood his defense of these islands not merely as military service, but as a spiritual act, his bunker was not just a tactical asset. It was a shrine. The rock and earth and reinforced concrete were a kind of sacred armor, and the conviction that this armor was impenetrable was not simply operational confidence. It was faith. What the Americans were building in the workshops of Hawaii and the improvisation stations of New Caledonia through 1944 was, without knowing it, a weapon designed specifically to negate that faith. By the spring of 1944, the Chemical Warfare Service's Pacific Operations Area Office in Honolulu had taken the next step beyond the improvised bowgun flamethrowers of Bougainville. American engineers acquired Canadian-designed Ronson flamethrowers, more reliable, more powerful, with greater range and fuel capacity than the M1A1, and adapted them to the turrets of M3A1 Stuart light tanks. Yet the resulting vehicle was officially designated as a flamethrower tank conversion, but quickly acquired a name that suited its character more precisely. The men who built it and the men who would fight beside it called it the Satan. 24 of these tanks were converted at Schofield Barracks in Hawaii and loaded aboard transports in the summer of 1944, bound for the Mariana Islands. Yet the capacity of the Satan tank represented a transformation from what had been cobbled together on Bougainville, where the improvised tanks of the 754th Battalion carried 10 gallons of flamethrower fuel, providing 20 seconds of total burn time. The Satan tanks carried 300 gallons, enough for sustained operations against multiple positions. They would need every gallon of it on Saipan and Guam, the islands whose limestone formations and cave systems were beginning to reveal the shape of what the Pacific War was becoming. The Japanese were not simply digging bunkers. They were turning entire islands into fortresses, moving their defenses underground, accepting that everything on the surface might be destroyed by American firepower and planning around that assumption. Artillery could pulverize the surface. Naval gunfire could scour hillsides down to raw rock. None of it reached into the places where the Japanese soldiers waited in the dark. Only the flame could follow them there. The Satan tanks performed well in the Marianas. The terrain on Saipan, less dense jungle, more open volcanic rock, proved more compatible with tank operations than the Bougainville canopy, and the armored flame vehicles worked through cave entrances and bunker complexes with an efficiency that grew each week as tank infantry tactics matured. Japanese soldiers who had survived American bombardments that would have seemed unsurvivable learned for the first time that there was an American weapon which could reach into their shelter and fill it with something that no amount of fortification could stop. Fire needs no direct line of sight. Fire finds every gap. Fire turns the very oxygen within an enclosed space into a weapon against anyone drawing breath. The Satan tanks carried 300 gallons. On a single day's operation, a Satan could burn through position after position and keep moving. The mathematics were beginning to change in ways that Japanese commanders had not anticipated when they designed their defense-in-depth doctrine. But what happened on Saipan and Guam in the summer of 1944 was, in retrospect, a rehearsal. The performance for which this weapon had been building since those first improvised experiments on New Caledonia was still 6 months away, on a volcanic island shaped roughly like a pork chop. Sets 8 square miles of sulfurous rock and black volcanic ash, 650 miles south of Tokyo. Its Japanese name meant Sulphur Island. The Americans called it Iwo Jima. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi arrived on Iwo Jima in June of 1944 with orders to make the island's capture so costly that the Americans would recoil from the thought of invading the Japanese home islands. Kuribayashi was not a man who needed to be taught the lessons of the earlier island campaigns. Yet he had watched from a distance as position after position, built with faith in the beach-line defense, the suicidal banzai charge, the honor of meeting the enemy at the water's edge, had been swept away by American firepower. He was not going to repeat those mistakes. His plan was something that the American military had not yet encountered in its complete form. A fully subterranean defense of an entire island, designed not to stop the invasion at the beach, but to consume it from below, so day after day, week after week, until the price in American lives became politically and psychologically unendurable. Over the course of 8 months, Kuribayashi and his engineers converted the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima into a structure of almost incomprehensible complexity. 11 miles of fortified tunnels bored through solid rock at depths of 30, 40, sometimes 75 feet below the surface, connected 1,500 rooms, command posts, ammunition depots, hospital chambers, artillery emplacements, communications centers. Above ground, across the island's 8 square miles, there were 750 reinforced pillboxes and bunkers, each constructed with mutually supporting fields of fire, each tied into the tunnel network below so that its defenders could withdraw underground when surface conditions became untenable and re-emerge at a different position behind the advancing Americans. On Mount Suribachi alone, it's the extinct volcano at the island's southern tip. 7 stories of interior fighting positions had been carved into the rock. Kuribayashi's island was not a defensive line. It was a machine for killing. On February 19, 1945, 74,000 American Marines came ashore on Iwo Jima's black volcanic beaches. The preliminary naval bombardment had been going on for 72 days. Carrier aircraft had struck the island daily. B-29 superfortresses had dropped thousands of tons of ordnance. And of the 915 Japanese fortifications that American intelligence had identified before the landing, fewer than 200 had been silenced. The rest of Kuribayashi's island was intact, waiting, watching through slits of concrete and rock as the landing craft touched the black ash and the Marines stepped out into the sulphurous air of February. The initial landing met light resistance. For about an hour, the Marines moved inland through the volcanic sand, sinking to their ankles with every step. Then Kuribayashi gave the signal, and the island erupted. Marine Lieutenant Colonel Chandler Johnson, commanding the 2nd Battalion, 28th Marines, fired off a message to division headquarters that cut through every optimistic calculation of the preceding weeks. Enemy defenses much greater than expected. There was a pillbox every 10 feet. Support given was fine, but did not destroy many pillboxes or caves. What groups had to take them step by step, suffering severe casualties. Among the weapons that came ashore on the first day of the battle were 8 Sherman M4A3 tanks that had been modified at Pearl Harbor with the Navy, Mark I flamethrower in place of their main gun. These tanks could project a stream of napalm-thickened fire at a range of 150 yards. They carried 300 gallons of fuel. They were not used on the first day. The beaches were too congested. It's the tactical situation too fluid. But when they entered the fight on the second day and in the days that followed, their effect was immediate, decisive, and documented in language that war correspondents and Marine officers reached for superlatives to describe. The Marine Command's own history of the battle identified the M4A3R3 Zippo tank as the one weapon that caused the Japanese to leave their caves and rock crevices and run. Read that sentence again. Yet here was a defender, a soldier who had sworn to die in place, who had been embedded for months in fortifications that had survived 72 days of the most intensive aerial and naval bombardment the American military could deliver. And this tank, this rolling machine of fire, was causing him to leave his shelter and run. Not because the bunker had been breached by shells, not because infantry had found a gap in the wire, but because the fire reached inside. Yes, because fire does not care about the thickness of concrete. Because no man, however committed to death in the service of his emperor, can remain still and breathe inside a space that has been filled with burning napalm at over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Each of the 8 Zippo tanks consumed approximately 10,000 gallons of napalm every day of the battle. There were 36 days of fighting on Iwo Jima. At the mathematics of that consumption, the sheer volume of burning fuel that American industry had produced, shipped across thousands of miles of Pacific Ocean, and placed in the hands of men whose job was to carry it to the entrances of Japanese fortifications and pour it inside, represented something that no Japanese commander had incorporated into his strategic calculus when designing the defense of these islands. It was not merely a weapon, and it was a demonstration of a principle that the Japanese military had never fully reckoned with. The principle that American democratic industrial capacity was not simply large, it was unlimited in ways that a command economy built on the honor of sacrifice and the myth of spiritual invincibility could not replicate or even fully comprehend. Captain Frank C. Caldwell, a company commander with the 26th Marines, surveyed what he had witnessed over 36 days of combat on 8 square miles of volcanic rock and put it as clearly as any officer in the battle could. In my view, it was the flame tank more than any other supporting arm that won this battle. The Japanese commanders who observed the Zippo tanks at work on Iwo Jima were confronting something that violated the foundational assumption of their entire defensive doctrine. Colonel Baron Takechi Nishi, who had been assigned to command the island's armored forces, had brought with him to Iwo Jima a fleet of Type 97 Chiha tanks, Japan's best medium tank, a vehicle that had been adequate against the lighter-armed forces of China and Southeast Asia. The Chiha weighed 17 tons, mounted a 47mm gun in its Shinhoto variant, and had been the centerpiece of Japanese armored doctrine for nearly a decade. Against American M4 Shermans, the Chiha was at a severe disadvantage in armor, firepower, and reliability. But Nishi had been ordered to use his tanks not in mobile combat, which would have been suicidal given American firepower, but as camouflaged artillery positions, dug into the earth, stripped of mobility, converted into bunkers in a final admission that armored warfare in the Pacific was no longer an option for Japan. The Chiha, the pride of the Imperial Armored Corps, ended its war buried to its turret in volcanic rock, waiting to be burned out by the same machine it could never have confronted in the open. There is something in this image that speaks to more than the technological gap between the two sides. It speaks to a divergence of philosophies about what war was for and what it could accomplish. The Japanese military mind had concluded that the willingness to die was the ultimate tactical resource, that a soldier who genuinely did not fear death was worth more than any quantity of equipment or supply. This belief had driven the construction of Iwo Jima's tunnel system, had shaped Kuribayashi's defense-in-depth strategy, had given every Japanese soldier on the island his operational instructions. Kill 10 Americans before you die. It was a philosophy built on the scarcity of human life as a resource and the conversion of that scarcity into a kind of currency. Every death a payment toward the cost of American invasion. Every bunker a bank where that currency was stored. Yet what the Zippo tanks demonstrated, in 36 days and 300,000 gallons of napalm, was that the Americans could print more of that currency than Japan could spend. Of the 21,000 Japanese defenders on Iwo Jima, 1,083 survived the battle. That number includes men who were still hiding in the tunnel system 3 and 4 days after the American declaration of victory, men who continued to emerge and contest ground even after organized resistance had officially ended. General Kuribayashi himself was never found. His last documented message, sent on March 17, 1945, reads as a testament to the gap between expectation and reality that the preceding 4 weeks had opened. Battle situation come to the last moment. I want surviving officers and men to go out and attack enemy until the last. You have devoted yourself to the Emperor. Do not think of yourselves. I am always at the head of you all. The Empire had asked its soldiers to be stones. Yet the Zippo tanks had answered that question about stones. But even Iwo Jima, in its scale and its ferocity and its 36 days of concentrated horror, was not the final chapter of what the flamethrower tanks would accomplish in the Pacific War. That chapter was written on a larger island, in a longer battle, as with a weapon that had by then been refined into something that would have been unrecognizable to the men who improvised those first 10-gallon bowgun fittings in New Caledonia 18 months before. On April 1, 1945, April Fool's Day, which the troops noted with grim humor as something appropriate, the Allied invasion of Okinawa began. The island was 60 miles long, the largest and most complex objective yet attempted in the Pacific Island hopping campaign. The Japanese garrison numbered approximately 110,000 men. The American landing force numbered 184,000 on the first day alone, and would eventually involve 584,000 American soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines supported by 1,300 ships. It was, by any measure, the largest amphibious operation ever attempted in the Pacific, and its outcome would determine whether an invasion of the Japanese home islands was necessary or whether some other conclusion to the war could be found. Arriving with the American force was an armored unit unlike anything that had come ashore in any previous Pacific battle. The 713th Flame-Throwing Tank Battalion had been organized from the 42nd Armored Regiment at Camp Polk, Louisiana in August of 1942, fighting its origins as a conventional tank unit through a year of retraining in Hawaii before arriving at Okinawa in April of 1945 as something the Army had never before sent into combat, a dedicated, purpose-built armored flamethrower battalion in which every tank, all 54 of them, had been converted to carry the Ronson-type flamethrower fitted into the barrel of the 75mm main gun. Each tank carried 300 gallons of fuel. The effective range was 80 to 100 yards, twice the range of the improvised Bougainville weapons, 3 times the reliability of the Satin tanks on Saipan. The supply apparatus required to keep 54 flamethrower tanks operational was staggering. An expanded service company, a logistics chain stretching back across the Pacific, and a commitment from American industry to the continuous production of napalm-thickening compound that no other nation on Earth could have sustained. The 713th companies were parceled out across the Okinawa front, yet attached to Army and Marine infantry divisions advancing against the Shuri Line, the series of interlocking ridge and cave defenses in the island's southern sector that represented the culmination of everything Japanese military engineers had learned about fortification in 5 years of Pacific warfare. Every ridge was a bunker complex. Every valley was a killing ground. Every cave entrance was a fighting position protected by others on its flanks. As the American infantry pushing against the Shuri Line measured its daily advances in yards, sometimes in feet, artillery answered every Japanese gun with 100 guns of its own. Carrier aircraft flew thousands of sorties against positions that disappeared underground when the planes arrived and reappeared when they left. The Shuri Line held for weeks. The 713th's flamethrower tanks moved through that battle like a fire moving through a forest. On April 27th, and the battalion turned its tanks on caves and pillboxes near Onaga and Makinato airfield. On May 11th, the tanks worked in coordination with infantry and standard armor near Zebra Hill. On May 12th, the flamethrower tanks moved through the standard tanks, deliberately placed at the point of closest contact with the enemy, because only they could reach inside what the standard tanks and artillery could not destroy, and burned the town of Gaha and the high ground above it. In a single day's action, one tank was credited with killing between 75 and 100 enemy soldiers. On May 15th, Japanese soldiers attempted to reach the tanks with satchel charges strapped to their bodies. They did not reach them. By May 20th, 6 weeks into the battle, the 713th had killed 1,288 Japanese soldiers while losing 22 tanks to enemy action. By the time Okinawa fell to American forces in late June of 1945, the 713th Flame-Throwing Tank Battalion had consumed more than 200,000 gallons of napalm in its operations on the island. 200,000 gallons. For a single campaign, in a single battle, delivered by 54 tanks operated by 726 officers and men who had crossed the Pacific in landing ships and come ashore on a contested beach in the opening hours of the largest amphibious assault in Pacific history. Yet the battalion's final accounting on Okinawa recorded 4,788 Japanese soldiers killed and 49 captured, 49 in a garrison of over 100,000, because the ideology of the men in those bunkers left surrender so far outside the category of thinkable actions that even fire could not always persuade them toward life. Yet the battalion's own losses across the entire Okinawa campaign were 8 killed and 111 wounded, a ratio that spoke to the terrifying efficiency of what had been built, refined, and deployed since those first desperate improvised experiments on New Caledonia. For the Japanese tank officers who had trained in the armor doctrine of an army that still believed in the possibility of armored maneuver warfare, what the 713th represented was a kind of categorical impossibility. Yet the Type 97 Chiha and its variants had been designed for the same fundamental mission as every tank in every army: to move, to fight, to break through and exploit. But the terrain of the Pacific Islands had strangled Japanese armored doctrine in its infancy, and by 1945, the Japanese tanker who survived long enough to observe what American armor had become was not watching a development of the same general technology along parallel lines. Yet he was watching something that had evolved in response to a specific problem, his problem, the problem of the fortification, the bunker, the cave, and had been solved with the full industrial weight of a democracy that had converted its automobile plants and chemical factories and oil refineries into instruments of war without ever slowing the underlying engine of production that made all of it possible. The flame that the American flamethrower tanks carried across the Pacific was not simply napalm and compressed gas. It was the distillation of a productive capacity that had no equivalent on the other side of the war. When the 713th Flame-Throwing Tank Battalion drew upon its supply of napalm thickener to prepare 200,000 gallons of fuel for the Okinawa campaign, as it was drawing upon a supply chain that stretched from chemical plants in the American Midwest to fuel depots in Hawaii to logistics ships in the Philippine Sea, a chain that had been built, staffed, and sustained by an economy that was simultaneously producing bombers and tanks and ships and rifles and boots and canned rations and blood plasma in quantities that exceeded the combined industrial output of Japan and Germany and Italy at their peak. And every gallon of fuel that burned inside a Japanese bunker on Okinawa was a statement about what a free industrial society could build when it chose to build it. And the men inside those bunkers, men who had been told since childhood that spiritual purity and martial discipline could overcome material disadvantage, that the divine favor of the emperor would tip the scales against any weight of steel and fire the enemy could bring, those men were receiving, yet in the most direct and irreversible possible terms, the answer to that claim. There is a moment in the campaign record of the 713th that deserves to be held for a moment before this narration moves to its close. It is not a famous moment. No photograph was taken. No correspondent was watching. It comes from a small note in the battalion history, almost an aside, describing what happened on May 12, 1945. When the flamethrower tanks moved through the standard Shermans at Gaha to take the point of closest contact with the Japanese defenders on the high ground above the town. The note records that Japanese soldiers in the forward positions, upon seeing the flamethrower tanks approaching, recognizing, from the characteristic shape of the weapon protruding from what appeared to be a standard gun barrel, that these were not ordinary tanks, attempted to flee the positions they had sworn to hold to the last. Some ran from cave entrances into the open where the escorting infantry was waiting. Some attempted to withdraw deeper into the tunnel network where the fire would follow them. Some, the record implies without quite stating, simply ceased to be the soldiers they had trained to be and became men trying to survive, in the presence of something for which no ideology had ever prepared them. At this moment, this instant of transformation from soldier to something more fundamental is not a failure of courage. It is a recognition. It is the recognition that arrives when a belief system encounters a reality it cannot contain, when the architecture of conviction meets the architecture of fire, and the fire is bigger than the conviction, and there is no more instruction available from the code one has been given for living. The Japanese soldier who ran from the Gaja Ridge on May 12th, 1945 was not abandoning his beliefs. He was encountering, in the most visceral possible form, the limit of what those beliefs could do. General Kurebayashi had understood something of this in his own way before Iwo Jima fell. His letters home, fragments of which survived the battle and were translated years later, do not read as the documents of a man who believed in the mythology of invincibility. They read as the letters of a military professional who knew exactly what was coming, who had done everything that military engineering and tactical genius could accomplish, and who recognized that none of it would be enough. "We are sorry indeed we could not have defended the island successfully," he wrote in his final transmissions. It is not an apology for lack of effort. It is a confession that effort, however total, had met something that effort alone could not overcome. That something was not simply the flame. And it was the civilization that had produced the flame, the factories and refineries and chemical plants and logistics systems, and the industrial democracy that had funded and directed and supplied all of it, while simultaneously feeding and clothing and equipping a military force of 10 million men fighting in every ocean and on every continent. The flame was a product. The civilization that made it was the fact that mattered. The 713th Flame-Throwing Tank Battalion was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for its service on Okinawa. Of the 726 men who had crossed the Pacific aboard 10 landing ships and come ashore on April 7, 1945, 8 did not come home. 111 returned with wounds they would carry for the rest of their lives. As the Japanese soldiers they had faced in the caves and tunnels and pillboxes of the Shuri Line had died in numbers that the mind resists recording as anything other than a human tragedy, regardless of the cause that had placed them there. 4,788 accounted for, 49 taken alive. And in the space between those numbers lives every ideology about sacrifice and invincibility, and the transcendence of the mortal body that the Imperial Japanese military establishment had constructed and handed to its soldiers as their inheritance, their obligation, their reason for being. The Zippo burned it all, not in triumph, not in celebration, but in the same patient, methodical, industrial way that the whole Pacific War had been prosecuted, one island at a time, one bunker at a time, one cave entrance at a time, until the mathematics of attrition had run to their conclusion, and the last garrison had been reduced to a fraction of its original strength, and a general whose body was never found had sent his last message into the dark and closed the transmission. There is something that the flame tank teaches, if one is willing to learn it in the way that history teaches, and not in the way that ideology teaches. It teaches that the idea of an impregnable position is always, and in the end, a temporary condition, that every wall built by human hands can be reached by a sufficiently creative response, that the greatness of a civilization is not measured by the perfection of its defenses, but by the fertility of its problem-solving, by the capacity of free men working in free institutions to look at an impossible situation and find, in a machine shop in New Caledonia or a naval base in Pearl Harbor, some adaptation that the enemy never imagined. Yet the improvised bowgun flamethrowers of Bougainville were not elegant. They were not sophisticated. They ran dry in 20 seconds and had to be hauled back to the rear to be refilled. But they worked. And because they worked, better engineers built better weapons, and by the time the war reached Okinawa, the 54 specially built armored tanks were consuming 200,000 gallons of napalm in service of the same principle that had first been tested in a jungle clearing along the Torokina River in the rain and smoke of a January morning in 1944. In the early summer of 1945, and as the Okinawa campaign was drawing to its close and American planners were beginning to assemble the enormous logistical machinery of Operation Downfall, the projected invasion of the Japanese home islands, the flamethrower tanks were being counted, catalogued, and prepared for the next campaign. The 713th was scheduled for the invasion of Kyushu. The same tanks, the same battalion, the same 300 gallons of fuel per vehicle, the same 80 to 100-yard stream of fire. So there were, in the estimates of the planners, between 600,000 and 1 million American casualties projected for the home island invasion. The Japanese had mobilized millions of civilians, armed with bamboo spears, to reinforce their regular military forces. The Bushido Code had been extended, in the final extremity of the national defense, to the entire population. The flame tanks would have needed to burn for a very long time. The invasion never came. In August of 1945, something else burned. Just 2 cities, 2 flashes, two conclusions that arrived so quickly and so absolutely that the entire apparatus of fanatical defense, the bamboo spears, the tunnel networks, the ideology of death before dishonor, simply stopped. The Emperor spoke, and in a voice that carried over radio for the first time, he told his people that the unendurable must be endured. But in that moment of ending, and it is worth pausing on what the flamethrower tanks had already accomplished, not as instruments of the final victory, but as documents of the process by which that victory was made. From Bougainville to Saipan to Iwo Jima to Okinawa, the flame had moved through the Pacific War as both a weapon and a proof, or a proof that the American genius for practical improvisation, for taking what is available and adapting it to what is necessary, could outpace any defensive architecture that a command military in a closed society could construct. A proof that the industrial capacity of a democracy is not simply larger than that of its adversaries. It is qualitatively different because it draws upon the creativity of free people solving free problems with the resources of a free market. And that combination produces things that no central planner could have designed or predicted. The napalm in those tanks, 300 gallons per vehicle, 200,000 gallons for a campaign, uncountable millions of gallons across the entire Pacific War, was not simply fuel. It was the physical expression of an economy that had built, in the space of 4 years, the greatest military force in the history of the world, while simultaneously maintaining a standard of living that its soldiers on distant islands could taste in every ration box and every crate of ammunition and every replacement part that arrived on schedule across 5,000 miles of open ocean. Japanese soldiers who were subsisting on reduced rice rations in the caves of Okinawa, who had been told that the American serviceman was soft and materialistic and would not endure hardship, you watched the 713th supply trucks roll forward with their drums of napalm and understood, perhaps for the first time, what they were actually fighting. They were fighting not an army, but a civilization. And a civilization that could produce 200,000 gallons of fire for a single island campaign was not a civilization that was going to run short of fire. The flame is gone now. The caves and bunkers of Iwo Jima and Okinawa have been sealed or opened as memorials, and tourists walk through them in the Pacific sunshine and try to imagine what it was to be inside, in the dark, with the walls vibrating from the impact of shells above, and the smell of sulfur in the air and the sound, in the distance, growing closer, of a tank engine approaching the entrance. The Type 97 Chiha tanks that survived the Pacific battles are museum pieces, rust and memory, yet preserved behind glass in ways that honor the soldiers who served in them without honoring the cause that sent them to their deaths. The 54 Shermans of the 713th Flame Throwing Tank Battalion were decommissioned after the war, their flamethrower conversions removed, their armored hulls returned to the general inventory of a demobilizing army. But the principle they carried across the Pacific did not demobilize, and it lives in every workshop where an engineer looks at an impossible problem and reaches not for a standard solution, but for an improvised one. It lives in every factory floor where the workers understand that what they are building will eventually protect the lives of people they will never meet. It lives in the fundamental conviction, tested in the most absolute terms on 8 square miles of volcanic rock and 60 miles of Okinawan limestone, that the civilization which can outproduce, out-supply and out-innovate its enemy is not simply the stronger civilization. It is the one that deserves to win. The flame moved through the Pacific, and wherever it passed, the darkness that had believed itself permanent discovered that it was not.